When the war ended, they were ready for punishment. They were the enemy. Captured soldiers branded with defeat pulled from the ashes of a broken Reich. They expected chains, interrogation rooms, barbed wire and barking guards, the cold judgment of the victors. But when they stepped off the trucks and into the grey light of a British morning, they didn't find torture chambers or firing squads. They found shovels, bricks, cement. The country that had bombed their cities, that had fought them across deserts and beaches and burning skies, now asked them to rebuild its own. Not as prisoners exactly, not as free men either, but as something stranger. Something history had never quite seen before. This is the untold story of the German prisoners who helped rebuild Britain, who found redemption not in war but in work, who laid the foundations of peace with the same hands that once held rifles. They came in chains, but they left behind something unbreakable. May 1945. Britain had survived, but only barely. Victory in Europe. The words crackled through radios in homes across the island, met with tears and church bells and exhausted relief. But when the celebrations faded and the bunting came down, what remained was a country on its knees. London lay scarred and broken. Coventry, Birmingham, Plymouth cities gutted by the Blitz, their skylines jagged with the teeth of ruined buildings. Half the bridges across the Thames damaged or destroyed. Factories silent, their machinery dismantled for the war effort, their workers scattered or dead. The railways stuttered, the docks sat empty. And everywhere, the rubble. Britain had thrown everything into the fight. 5 years of total war had drained the nation's blood and treasure. 500,000 soldiers still stationed abroad, holding the fragile peace in Germany, Italy, North Africa. At home, the population was exhausted. Women who had built Spitfires now faced the grim arithmetic of reconstruction. Old men, teenagers, the injured. Not enough hands for the work that peace demanded. And yet, by some dark irony of war, Britain was not short of men. 400,000 of them, to be precise. German soldiers. Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine. Captured in the sands of North Africa, the hedgerows of Normandy. The final desperate battles, as the Reich collapsed into rubble and ash. They had surrendered their weapons, but not their labour. And now they sat in camps across the British countryside, waiting. The question was almost too strange to ask aloud. Could a nation use its former enemies to rebuild itself? Could the hands that had dropped bombs on British cities now lay bricks in British towns? Could you ask a man to repair the same roads his army had tried to destroy? And if you did, what would that say about victory, about mercy, about the line between justice and pragmatism in the aftermath of the bloodiest war in human history? The answer came not in policy debates or parliamentary speeches, but in the quiet, practical movements of exhausted people making impossible choices. A slow fade from images of bombed London to the first column of German prisoners marching past a Welsh hillside, their faces hollow with uncertainty, their uniforms faded grey against the green. The beginning of an unexpected alliance, the start of something history would struggle to name. Summer 1945. The camps spread across Britain like a hidden archipelago. Yorkshire moorlands, Devon valleys, the flatlands of Lincolnshire, Welsh hillsides where sheep grazed near barbed wire, repurposed airfields and hastily constructed Nissen huts, their corrugated metal roofs glinting dull in the persistent rain. The German prisoners arrived in trucks under heavy guard, their eyes adjusting to a landscape they had only seen through bomb sites or propaganda reels. Some had been held in North Africa for years. Others were fresh from the Rhine crossings, from the chaos of a collapsing Reich. They climbed down onto British soil, expecting the treatment they themselves had given. The brutal efficiency of camps they had heard whispered about in the final months of the war. Instead, they found silence, cold tea, thin blankets, a bureaucratic processing that felt almost mundane in its indifference. Fingerprints, registration numbers, camp assignments. The machinery of captivity, yes, but without the sadism they had braced themselves for. Kurt Hoffmann, a former Wehrmacht engineer from Hamburg, would later write in his diary, "They searched our bags, but not our souls. I had imagined hate, instead I found silence. They did not beat us, they did not curse us. They simply looked at us the way you might look at a problem to be solved." But if the prisoners were confused, the British civilians were terrified. 5 years of propaganda had done its work. The Germans were monsters, baby killers. The Blitz was still fresh in memory, the sound of sirens, the crump of bombs, the morning after, when you walked outside to find your neighbor's house simply gone. Women had lost husbands, children had lost fathers. And now these men, these enemies, were being housed just beyond the village behind fences that suddenly seemed far too thin. In some towns, locals gathered at the camp gates silent and furious. Women spat toward the wire. Old men turned their backs. There were whispers of vigilante justice, of fires that might be set, of what should be done to men who had brought such darkness to their island. The camp commanders varied wildly in temperament. Some were officers who had lost friends in the bombing raids, who ran their camps with barely controlled rage, who saw every prisoner as a debt unpaid. Others were pragmatists, farmers in uniform, men who looked at 400,000 pairs of hands and saw not monsters but manpower, who understood that Britain's survival depended not on punishment but on production. The fences went up, watchtowers, guard rotations, the architecture of control. But something strange began to happen in those first weeks. The prisoners, expecting brutality, found routine instead. Roll call, meals, work assignments, letters from home when they could get through, Red Cross parcels. The slow grinding normality of captivity. And work there was. Barbed wire glinted in the morning fog as British officers walked, the lines clipboards in hand, discussing not vengeance but crop yields. How many men for the harvest? How many for the road repairs? How many to clear the rubble from the bombed-out housing estates that still scarred the cities? The men who once dug trenches for war now dug foundations for peace. In the same soil they had once come to destroy, they sank their spades and lifted their hammers and began the strange, silent labor of reconstruction. There were no speeches, no ceremonies of reconciliation, just the uneasy coexistence of exhaustion and necessity, guards who watched men who watched back, distrust mixing with the pragmatic realization that the work had to be done and these were the hands available to do it. At night in the huts, the prisoners lay awake, listening to the sounds of a foreign countryside. Sheep bleating, distant church bells, the rain on metal roofs. Some wrote letters that would never be answered. Others stared at the ceiling and wondered what remained of their homes, their families, their country. They had expected punishment. Instead, they had found something more unsettling. They had found usefulness, and in the gap between those two expectations, something unexpected would begin to grow. By early 1946, the British government made it official. The employment of prisoners of war policy. Bureaucratic language wrapped around a simple truth. Britain needed labour more than it needed revenge. The prisoners would work. Not as slaves, technically. There were Geneva Convention protocols to observe international eyes watching. But not as free men either. They would earn minimal pay, mostly in canteen tokens, cigarettes, chocolate, the small currencies of captivity. The government called it reparation in labour, a debt paid not in gold but in sweat. The work details fanned out across the countryside like veins carrying blood to a wounded body, repairing roads cratered by neglect and bombing, rebuilding houses reduced to hollow shells, harvesting crops in fields where British farmhands had gone to war and never returned, clearing rubble from city centres where children still played among the ruins. They worked in crews, guards, watching from a distance that grew wider with each passing month. German hands lifted British timber, laid British bricks, mixed British mortar. The irony was too obvious to ignore and too necessary to dwell on. At first, the resentment was palpable. Women who had sheltered in underground stations while German bombs fell now watched German men repair the damage. The contradiction was obscene. Some refused to look. Others stood at the edges of work sites, arms crossed, faces hard, with an anger that needed no words.
There's too many of them.
In Kent, a farmer named Thomas Hartley later recalled, "The first day they came to my fields, I couldn't look at them. My son died at Dunkirk. These men wore the same uniform, spoke the same language as the ones who killed him. I told the foreman to keep them away from the house. Told my wife not to bring them water no matter how hot it got. But something shifted, slowly, imperceptibly at first. The work was hard, brutal even. Backs bent for hours in the fields. Hands bloodied by masonry work, the kind of labour that strips away everything but exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, something old and bitter began to erode. A prisoner drops his tool. A British worker hands it back without thinking. A shared cigarette during a break. a nod of acknowledgement when a difficult task is completed. Small gestures barely noticed that began to thread through the hostility, like cracks in ice. By autumn, the transformation was undeniable. In villages across Britain, the same women who had spat near camp fences now left sandwiches at the edge of work sites. Not out of forgiveness, perhaps, not even out of kindness, but out of something more fundamental. The recognition of shared humanity in shared labour. Hartley's story continued. They came as the enemy. But when the harvest came in, and it was the best harvest we'd had in years, they were just men with blisters, same as us. Tired, grateful for a meal. I still hated what they'd done, but I couldn't hate them, not anymore. The documentary footage would show it. Montages that captured what words struggled to express. German POWs lifting timber beams alongside British carpenters, working side by side to rebuild the roof of a bombed-out church, their hammers falling in rhythm. A prisoner steadying a ladder while a local man climbs. The camera catching moments of casual cooperation that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. There were no grand declarations, no treaties signed over these small acts of reconciliation. Just the rhythm of hammers, the scrape of shovels, the sound of men working toward a shared goal, even if they couldn't yet articulate what that goal meant. Work became a language that transcended the war. In the fields and on the construction sites, nationality mattered less than competence. The question wasn't where you were from, but whether you could do the job, whether you showed up, whether you pulled your weight. The prisoners began to take pride in their work, not because they loved Britain, not because they had abandoned their homeland, but because pride in labour is a fundamental human need, because building something is better than destroying it, because after years of war creation felt like redemption. The unspoken truce of effort, that's what it was. Labour softening hatred, one brick, one board, one harvest at a time. By 1946, something unexpected was happening behind the wire. The camps were changing. Not in their physical structure, the fences still stood, the guard towers still watched, the roll calls still punctuated each day, but in their character, in their atmosphere. The camps were evolving from holding pens into something stranger and more complex. Communities. The prisoners had time, vast expanses of it. Hours after work details returned before lights out. Sundays, the dead spaces between labour and sleep. And into those spaces life began to creep back. Theatres emerged. Crude stages built from scrap lumber and canvas, but stages nonetheless. Men who had been actors in Berlin or Munich before the war now performed again, this time for audiences of fellow prisoners and increasingly curious British guards. Shakespeare translated into German, comedies that earned laughter in 2 languages. The universal grammar of performance transcending the barrier of captivity. Libraries appeared stocked with donated books and Red Cross shipments, technical manuals, novels, Bibles. Men who had lost everything could still lose themselves in pages. Education classes formed organically, mathematics, English lessons, carpentry skills. The transmission of knowledge as an act of defiance against the erosion of self. Sports fields sprouted in the empty spaces between barracks. Football matches that drew crowds. Boxing rings where men could channel frustration into organized combat. The physical expression of life continuing, of bodies refusing to surrender to confinement. And music, always music. Harmonicas smuggled in pockets, guitars fashioned from crates and wire. Choir groups that practiced in the evenings, their voices carrying across the compounds. Songs from home that ached with longing. Folk melodies that reminded them they were still human, still capable of beauty. The Red Cross parcels became lifelines, chocolate, cigarettes. Letters from home when they got through. News from a Germany that many barely recognized anymore. A country divided, occupied, transformed beyond recognition. Some letters brought joy, others brought grief. Many brought nothing but silence, the absence of response, speaking louder than words. And slowly, cautiously, the British locals began to appear. Not with anger this time, with curiosity. The fences that had divided conqueror and conquered now separated only men and misunderstanding. Women brought children to watch the football matches. Teenagers stood at the wire, fascinated by the foreignness of the prisoners. Old men engaged in halting conversations, broken English, meeting broken German, finding common ground in farming techniques, or the weather, or the universal complaints of getting older. The prisoners carved. Woodwork became a cottage industry behind the wire. intricate figures whittled from scrap, toys for British children, crucifixes, small ships with impossible detail. These objects began to move beyond the fences traded for cigarettes or chocolate, or simply given as gifts, each carving a small bridge across the chasm of war. Religious gatherings took on new significance: Catholic masses, Protestant services, the rituals of faith providing structure and meaning in a world stripped of both. And then came the chapel. A British chaplain named Reverend William Morris would describe it years later, his voice still thick with the memory. They built it out of scrap wood, nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a cross they'd fashioned from planks. But on Christmas Eve, 1946, they invited us in, the guards, some of the local villagers. We didn't know what to expect. He paused in the telling even decades later. They sang Silent Night first in German, then we joined in English. 2 languages, 1 melody. And in that moment, in that crude chapel built by enemy hands, I understood something I'd spent the whole war trying to forget. That these men had mothers who sang them the same songs, that they prayed to the same God. That the war had made them enemies, but it hadn't made them evil. The camps remained, but their meaning had changed. They were no longer just places of confinement. They were spaces where humanity reasserted itself against the dehumanization of war, where culture survived captivity, where the simple act of singing together became more powerful than any propaganda. It was no longer clear who was rebuilding whom. The prisoners were reconstructing Britain's infrastructure, but in the process, both sides were reconstructing something more fundamental. The belief that enemies could become, if not friends, then at least fellow human beings. Redemption had no ceremony. It arrived in small moments, unannounced and unplanned. A loaf of bread shared during a lunch break, a tool returned without being asked, a gate left unlocked because the guard knew the prisoners would come back. Trust growing like moss on stone, slow, unremarkable, impossible to pinpoint the moment it began. By late 1946, something remarkable was happening across Britain. Prisoners were being allowed to work unsupervised. Not all of them, not everywhere, but increasingly, camp commanders were making calculations that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The farmer needs help with the harvest. The crew is short-handed at the construction site. The prisoner has proven reliable day after day, week after week, so the guard stays behind. And the prisoner walks to work beside British civilians, not behind them, not in chains. Day passes became more common. A prisoner might spend the morning repairing a village tractor, eat lunch at a local farm, return to camp in the evening. The barbed wire was still there. The prisoner was still a prisoner. But the nature of captivity had fundamentally shifted. Franz Weber, a former Luftwaffe mechanic from Stuttgart, found himself repairing farm equipment in a village in Shropshire. The work was delicate, precise, the kind of mechanical problem-solving he'd done on aircraft engines during the war. Local children gathered to watch, fascinated by his tools, his methodical approach, the way his hands moved with practiced confidence. The elderly farmer, a man named George Patterson, watched too. Patterson had lost his son over Germany, a bomber crew that never came home. He should have hated this man. By every reasonable measure, he should have sent him away. Instead, he brought him tea. Years later, Patterson would say, he fixed more than the engine that day. I can't explain it properly. But watching him work, seeing the care he took, the pride I realized my hatred wasn't hurting him. It was only hurting me. And I was tired of hurting. These moments multiplied across the countryside. A prisoner teaching a British boy how to carve wood. Another helping an elderly woman repair her garden fence, refusing payment, the work itself being enough. Conversations that started with hand gestures and broken phrases, evolving into something approaching friendship, and inevitably, impossibly, some fell in love. The official policy was clear: fraternization was forbidden. Prisoners were not to form relationships with British citizens, especially not romantic ones. The regulations were explicit, the penalties severe. But regulations could not police the human heart, and enforcement grew lax as the months stretched into years. A German prisoner meets a British woman at a farm where he works. She brings water to the fields. Their eyes meet. Conversations begin, tentative, awkward, charged with everything unspoken. He has lost his family in the bombing of Dresden. She has lost her fiancé at Monte Cassino. They recognize in each other the same emptiness, the same need for connection in a world that has taken so much. The relationships were complicated, controversial. Many in the community condemned them as betrayals. How could a British woman love a German after everything? The social pressure was immense, but love, stubborn and defiant, persisted anyway. Some of these relationships would last. Prisoners who, when finally given the choice to return to Germany, would choose instead to stay, to build lives in the country that had once been their enemy, to marry British women and raise children who would carry both legacies in their blood. The transformation was complete when prisoners began walking home from work beside civilians, not behind guards, when the morning became not a march to forced labour, but a commute to a job. When the question shifted from will they escape to will they show up on time, this was redemption without fanfare, without official recognition, just the quiet accumulation of trust, built one honest day of work at a time. The fence remained, but increasingly, it seemed like habit rather than necessity. A formality maintained because no one quite knew how to officially declare it obsolete. The war had made them enemies, but work time and proximity were slowly making them something else, something history had few words for. The letters began arriving in 1946, official notices, repatriation schedules. The war had been over for more than a year, and now the machinery of return was grinding into motion. You are authorized to return home. Your release date is assigned. Report for processing. Home. The word sat heavy on the page, freighted with questions no letter could answer. For many, home was a memory wrapped in smoke. Cities bombed to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. Families scattered or dead. The Germany they had left was the Third Reich, confident and cruel. The Germany they would return to was divided, occupied, broken. A country trying to understand what it had become, what it had done, what remained. The repatriation process was gradual, waves of releases spreading across 1946, 1947, 1948, priority given to the sick, the elderly, those with families confirmed alive. But for many prisoners, the prospect of leaving brought not relief but dread. Heinrich Müller, a carpenter from Bavaria who had spent 3 years in a camp near Dover, wrote in his final letter to the farmer he'd worked for. They said we were free to go, but freedom felt heavier than the chains. What am I free to return to? A country I don't recognize, a family that may not exist. Here, at least I know what tomorrow looks like. The farewells were complicated. Guards who had watched these men for years, who had shared cigarettes and stories, and the slow erosion of enmity now processed their paperwork with something approaching regret. British families who had grown accustomed to prisoner labour, and more than labour to the presence of these men in their daily lives, faced the strange emptiness their departure would leave. At the camp's departure, days were marked with rituals both formal and improvised. Final roll calls, the return of personal effects stored since capture, forms signed, documents stamped, and then the trucks arriving to carry them to ports, to ships, to a homeland that felt increasingly foreign. Children cried at the camp gates. British children who had befriended prisoners, who had learned German songs and received carved toys, who understood only that someone they cared about was leaving. The prisoners hardened by war and captivity often wept too. In some villages, locals gathered to see them off, not with celebration, not quite, but with acknowledgement. Hands shaken, addresses exchanged. Promises to write, though both parties knew how rarely such promises survived the Atlantic crossing and the chaos of post-war Europe. But not everyone left. As the repatriation process continued, a pattern emerged. Thousands of prisoners, when given the choice, requested to stay. Over 25,000 ultimately remained in Britain permanently. Some had married British women and couldn't imagine leaving their new families. Others had skills Britain desperately needed: carpenters, electricians, mechanics, farmers. Still others simply had nothing to return to. The applications to remain were processed through bureaucracy that struggled to categorize them. Not refugees, not immigrants in the traditional sense. Former enemies requesting permission to stay among their former captors. The very concept seemed to break established frameworks. For those who did return, the journey was often devastating. Trains crowded with men in faded uniforms, crossing through France into the fractured zones of occupied Germany. The landscape through the windows told the story: towns reduced to skeletal ruins, fields still scarred by battle populations, hollow-eyed and hungry. Some arrived to find their homes intact, their families waiting. Joyful reunions tears the slow work of rebuilding lives. but many found only absence, houses destroyed, families dead or disappeared. The coordinates of home leading to empty lots and unanswered questions. Letters arrived back in Britain, forwarded to the families prisoners had worked for. Thank you for the kindness you showed me. I am back in Cologne, though there is little left of it. I think often of the harvest we brought in together. Those were strangely among the best months of my life. The paradox was inescapable. Liberation mixed with loss, freedom tangled with grief. They had been prisoners, yes, but captivity had given them purpose, community, a reason to rise each morning. And now released into a broken homeland, many discovered that freedom could be its own kind of prison. Home for some was now a word without a place. Stand today on a bridge in Yorkshire, walk down a rural lane in Devon, enter a village school in Kent. Look closely at the brickwork, the foundations, the sturdy construction that has weathered 70 years of British rain and wind. You are standing on history that no one speaks about. The hands that once held rifles laid these bricks. The men who flew bomber missions over London mixed this mortar. The soldiers who once aimed their weapons at British troops now built the roads those trucks still travel on. The physical legacy is everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Roads that connect villages across the countryside, repaired or rebuilt entirely by German POW labour in the desperate years after the war. Bridges spanning rivers that would have remained impassable for years without their work. Schools where British children learned to read constructed by men who had fought against their parents. Farms across Britain owe their survival to prisoner labour. The harvests of 1,946 and 1,947 critical years, when Britain teetered on the edge of famine, were brought in by German hands working British fields. Without that labour, the crops would have rotted, the livestock would have died. The agricultural collapse would have compounded the industrial devastation. Housing estates that rose from bombed-out neighbourhoods, blocks of council housing that provided shelter for thousands of displaced families, were built in significant part by POW labour. Men who had once destroyed homes now constructed them. The symmetry was almost too perfect, too deliberately poetic, yet it was simply the reality of reconstruction. The numbers tell a story that memory has largely forgotten. 400,000 prisoners of war working across Britain over 3 years. Estimates suggest approximately 1 billion man-hours of labour. 1 billion. The mathematical weight of it staggers the imagination. If you were to calculate the economic value in today's currency, accounting for inflation and comparative wages, you would arrive at figures in the billions of pounds. 30 to 40% of rural infrastructure repaired or rebuilt by German prisoners. Roads, bridges, barns, irrigation systems, the foundational network that allowed Britain to transition from war economy to peace, from destruction to recovery. Without this labour, the timeline of British reconstruction would have extended years, perhaps a decade longer. The nation's recovery would have stumbled, faltered, possibly failed. The irony is inescapable. Britain won the war through sacrifice, courage, and the sustained will of its people. But it won the peace in part through the labour of the defeated. There are plaques on some buildings, though not many. Small brass markers that acknowledge construction dates, rebuilt 1946 to 1948. No mention of who did the rebuilding. History has a way of editing out complications, smoothing over the contradictions that make victory less triumphant and defeat less absolute. But the structures remain, testament to an extraordinary moment when enemies became builders, when the destructive energy of war was channeled imperfectly, but genuinely into the creative work of peace. Drone footage could capture it now, sweeping over the British countryside, the camera revealing farms and villages, roads threading through green hills, bridges arching over rivers, and then the footage could fade, dissolving into archival images from 1946. The same landscapes, but raw and wounded. And in those wounds, small figures with shovels and hammers. Men in faded grey uniforms working beside British civilians, rebuilding what war had torn down. The paradox at the heart of this story: destruction is quick, reconstruction is slow. The bombers took hours to destroy what took years to rebuild. And the rebuilding required cooperation, patience, and the setting aside of entirely justified rage. Britain could have left the rubble as monuments to German cruelty, could have chosen vindictive justice over practical necessity. could have let the roads remain broken and the bridges stay collapsed as a lesson to future generations about the cost of aggression. Instead, pragmatically, and perhaps unconsciously, it chose to put its enemies to work. And in doing so, it built more than infrastructure. It built a precedent. A model, however flawed and incomplete, for how victors might treat the vanquished. How mercy and utility could coexist. How, even after total war, there might be a path toward something resembling reconciliation. The victory of peace was built in part by the defeated, and their work endures silent and unacknowledged beneath the feet of everyone who walks across modern Britain. Forgiveness was not declared, it was grown. Like the crops they planted together season after season, taking root in soil that had once seemed too bitter to bear anything good. The letters continued long after the trucks departed. Decades of correspondence between former prisoners and British families. Careful handwriting, crossing the channel, carrying news of births and deaths, harvests and hardships. The ordinary intimacies of lives that had briefly intersected and somehow remained connected. A farmer in Wales writes to a former prisoner in Hamburg, "The fence you repaired is still standing. Thought you'd want to know." The prisoner writes back, "I think of your fields often. They were kinder to me than I deserved." Some prisoners married British women and settled permanently, navigating the complicated social terrain of post-war Britain. These marriages were not easy, neighbours whispered. Some shops refused service. Children at school faced questions about their German surnames, about fathers who spoke with accents that reminded people of bombers and invasion fears. But the families persisted, German fathers raising British children, teaching them both languages, carrying two histories in one household. The children became living bridges between former enemies, their existence proof that reconciliation was possible at the most fundamental human level. The British public slowly and unevenly began to reconsider what enemy meant. The propaganda images of faceless German hordes gave way to memories of actual men. Hans, who fixed the tractor, Karl, who carved toys for the children, Friedrich, who sang in the church choir. The abstraction of evil became complicated by the reality of individual human beings. This was not universal. Some communities never forgave. Some veterans could not separate the man who worked their field from the army that had killed their brothers. The wounds were too deep, the losses too personal. And that resistance was valid too. Forgiveness cannot be mandated, only offered when ready. But in many places something shifted. By the 1960 something remarkable began happening. Reunions. Former German POWs, now middle-aged men with families of their own, travelled back to Britain. Not as prisoners this time, but as guests. Invited by the families they had worked, for the villages they had helped rebuild. In a village in Somerset, 1965, a car pulls up to a familiar farmhouse. An elderly couple stands in the doorway watching as a German man steps out, his hair now grey, his face lined with 20 years of living. He had been 23 the last time he stood here. He is 43 now. The farmer's wife brings her hand to her mouth. Gunther, they embrace like family, because in some sense that is what they have become. The German man meets the farmer's grandchildren, tells stories about the harvest of 1,947 laughs, at memories of that brutal winter when the pipes froze, and they all worked together to keep the livestock alive. That evening in the village pub locals gather. Some remember him, others are too young but have heard the stories. He buys a round. Someone starts a song he used to sing while working. The pub joins in, badly laughing at the mangled German pronunciation. "One of us," someone says, raising a glass. And in that moment, in that small English pub, 70 miles from where the Luftwaffe once dropped bombs, he is. These scenes repeated across Britain through the 1960 and beyond. Former prisoners returning to camps now converted to industrial parks or housing estates, standing in fields that once held barracks, struggling to orient themselves in a landscape that had moved on while their memories stayed fixed. Modern footage would show it. Elderly men now in their 80s and 90s revisiting the sites of their captivity one last time before death takes the generation that lived through it. Standing where the fences used to be. Weeping not from bitterness but from the strange gratitude of survival. From the impossible mercy of having been treated in the end as human. Forgiveness arrived in these accumulated moments. Not in grand gestures or official apologies, but in the quiet recognition that shared labor had created shared humanity. That working side by side had made them, however, imperfectly neighbours in memory, if not in geography. Britain could have chosen vengeance. History would have understood. The world expected it. After 6 years of war, after the Blitz, after the bodies pulled from rubble, and the children who grew up in bomb shelters and the generation of young men who never came home. After all of that, Britain had earned the right to cruelty. Other nations chose differently. In the Soviet Union, German prisoners died by the hundreds of thousands in labor camps, worked to death in mines and factories, treated with the same brutality the Wehrmacht had shown during the invasion. Few mourned them. Justice, people said. Balance, what they had sown now harvested. Britain chose utility instead, and in that pragmatic, unglamorous decision it found something greater than revenge. By treating their captives as men rather than enemies, by giving them work instead of punishment, Britain rebuilt not just its roads and bridges, but something more fundamental, a moral foundation for the peace that followed. A precedent that rippled through the post-war world, subtle but significant. This was not mercy in the religious sense, not turning the other cheek. It was colder than that, more calculated. Britain needed labour. The prisoners provided it. The exchange was transactional, at least at first. But transactions between human beings have a way of becoming relationships. Proximity breeds understanding even when neither side wants it. And understanding, given time and shared purpose, can become something approaching compassion. The German prisoners did not deserve mercy if mercy is something earned. They had worn the uniforms of an army that had tried to bomb Britain into submission. Many had believed in the cause, at least at first. Some perhaps still did quietly in the privacy of their own thoughts. But Britain extended a kind of mercy anyway. Not from moral superiority, not from philosophical commitment to human rights, but from exhausted pragmatism, and that pragmatic mercy became accidentally and imperfectly a form of civilization reasserting itself after barbarism. The wider lesson is uncomfortable. It suggests that moral progress sometimes comes not from grand principles, but from mundane necessities. That forgiveness can be stumbled into rather than chosen. That the path from enemies to neighbours might begin with nothing more noble than needing someone to fix a fence. History remembers wars by their battles, the sweeping movements of armies, the dramatic turning points, the clear moral narratives of good triumphing over evil. But nations are rebuilt in the aftermath, in the messy, complicated work of peace, and that work rarely fits neat narratives. Britain's treatment of German POWs was imperfect. Some camps were harsh. Some prisoners were abused. The policy was inconsistent, the implementation flawed. This was not a moral triumph in any pure sense, but it was better than it could have been. And in the gap between what happened and what might have happened, there is something worth remembering. Something about how, even after the darkest war in human history, exhausted people can still choose, however imperfectly, to build rather than destroy. A quiet victory of civilization, not dramatic, not celebrated, but enduring. In the end, the prisoners and the captors built more than bridges and barns. They built understanding. Between enemy hands, mortar became meaning. The ruins of war became the foundation of peace. And in that strange alchemy of exhaustion and necessity, something transformed that neither side had planned for, or perhaps even wanted. They came in chains, these 400,000 men, defeated, expected to suffer, expected to pay the price that war demands of the losing side. But they left behind something unbreakable, something that still stands in the brickwork and roadways of Britain, something that echoes in the letters exchanged across decades, in the marriages that defied categories, in the reunions held in village pubs where former enemies drank together as old friends. They left behind proof that even after the darkest war in history, men can still choose to build. That hatred, however justified, can give way to something more practical and ultimately more powerful. That the hands which destroy can also repair. That redemption is not about grand gestures or official declarations, but about showing up each day to do the work. The war changed these men, all of them, British and German alike. It stripped away illusions about glory and heroism and left only the raw truth of violence and loss. But kindness changed history. Not dramatic kindness, not the kind celebrated in monuments or memorials, but the small accumulated kindnesses of shared labour, of bread broken together, of trust extended cautiously and repaid faithfully, of fences that remained but whose meanings shifted until they became merely habit rather than hatred. Between 1945 and 1948, over 400,000 German prisoners of war worked in Britain. Many stayed. Their legacy still stands in walls, roads, and memories that refuse to fade. War changes men, but kindness changes history. And in the soil of that exhausted island, watered by rain and sweat and unexpected mercy, both nations planted seeds that would grow into an imperfect but genuine peace.